I'd like to ask you all to take a second and close your eyes and observe the images that come into your mind when I say the words urban development. I would imagine for most of you, you got images of buildings or roads, perhaps airports or the new bus system. But I would doubt that the majority of you had images of health or pollution or perhaps community or informality, sharing, eating. Now, our current approach to urban development is narrowly defined through the ideas of spatial and technical solutions, where the modern and gleaming city is seen to be the only vision for cities in our future. I would like to challenge today that the complexity of our urban development can be dealt with through the provision of taps, toilets, and houses. Through the provision of taps, toilets, and houses. This way of thinking is very much embedded in thinking that has dominated our modern era. And I would like to propose that we shift this way of thinking in order to address this complexity. It requires that we take a realistic view of the city that is inclusive and respectful of all people living in our city. It requires that we stop believing that we have the right solution for someone else. And also, why do we consider that to be urban development and that to be an urban challenge? Now, a group of urban dwellers living in an informal settlement with whom I have been learning and sharing over the past few years have shown me the invaluable insights into how people understand their own environments and how they are able to come up with solutions that address the complexity of their lived reality in a way that our current approaches are not able to do. Our primary response to informal settlements and backyard dwellers is the housing policy in South Africa, which is a very one-dimensional approach to the provision of physical infrastructure. If we look at the numbers, the city of Cape Town is currently dealing with a housing backlog of 400,000. This means that there are 400,000 people living in accommodation that doesn't meet the engineering and building standards. The city of Cape Town receives about 250 million a year, with which they build approximately 8,000 subsidized housing units. Now, if we project this into the future, at a population growth of 1.44%, it will take us approximately 60 years to address the current backlog, or the backlog including the growth. If we were to increase it to 42,000 per year, we would address it in 10 years, and if we were to double it, we would address it in 30 years. Given these numbers, I think it is time that we accept that informal settlements are just another urban typology, alongside shopping malls and suburbs. Now, it's not okay to say that the conditions within these settlements are acceptable, but we must start to recognize that people have dedicated a significant amount of time and money into creating a home for themselves in the city. A study conducted by Urban Landmark asked a significant number of people throughout South Africa living in informal settlements how moving into that settlement had affected their lives. Interestingly, 47% said that their lives had improved, while 30% said it had stayed the same, and only 20% said that their lives had gotten worse. Now, there are three main ideas that I would like to touch on today, and the first is the idea of standards and what the impact of standards are in our cities. The second is the idea of radical change within a one-dimensional focus on physical infrastructure. And the third is the Cartesian Worldview, within which comprehensive rational planning approach is embedded. Setting standards, while they are well-intended, and in this case the building and engineering standards, they ensure that buildings are safe, that we guard it against fire, but we must recognize that they do have unintended consequences, one of which is the creation of the dual city, where those living above the standard are considered to be legal, and those living below the standard are considered to be illegal. Now, the importance of this idea is that it creates a power relationship within the city, with those above holding a certain amount of power over those below, specifically in the way that resources are allocated and in the way that we imagine the future of our cities. In addition, it sets up a goal to which the system must strive to achieve, and this has been fundamental in driving the housing policy to date. In addition, the housing policy is driven by a vision of radical change, where we want to see all the people who are living below the standard moved into accommodation that meets the standard. But currently, this is happening at a rate of 2% per year. So what is happening to the rest of the people who are left behind? Now, the Cartesian worldview, I would like to use a visual example to explain it. It is very much focused on the analysis and categorization of these squares at a close distance. But this obsession with a close distance and zooming into smaller and smaller pieces means that we don't get to see what the bigger picture is. We don't see the out-of-focus features of Gandhi. Now, we have been looking at these squares and perhaps recording all the different gray values, creating tables of edge lengths, documenting the different brightnesses. But in obsessing with all of this detail, we don't see the bigger picture. So in trying to recognize a system, it's not the detail that matters. And it's not to say that the detail doesn't matter at all, but just that we need to zoom in and out. So when we stop obsessing with the detail, we start to see that in observing the detail, it's the boundaries between the details that start to create separation. In trying to address this, as well as the planning approach that is integral to this way of thinking, which is very much looking at the squares and a rational approach, is called comprehensive rational planning. Now, this approach is generally dominated by creating a master plan where it's engineered from the top down based on common understanding and driven by ideas of scientific knowledge and modern technology. Now, I've been developing a descriptive model of an informal settlement to try to step back and look at what this bigger picture might be, using a material flow analysis and a capital analysis. Now, an important form of social capital that was identified by the residents is the street committees. Now, the street committees throughout South Africa, a lot of them are at the moment highly dysfunctional and corrupt. And I would like to try to make a link between this and the housing beneficiary selection process. The street committees have a complex set of roles and responsibilities, including negotiating the buying and selling of houses, dealing with issues of crime and safety, job allocation, running a burial fund. And they form an important role within these settlements. Now, in 2007, in the settlement that I was researching, it was reported that there was a major disturbance to the system when people were relocated out of the settlement into housing projects in Imfoleni and Delft. Now, the way that housing beneficiary selection process works is that if a project is happening in in, say, Inyanga, an equal number of people from informal settlements and backyard dwellers within that area are relocated into the housing project. And then a number of people off the housing waiting list within the greater metropolitan city are relocated into that housing. Now, it's not difficult to imagine that the social capital that somebody holds about the informal system, who's been living in that system who's been on the housing waiting list for between 15 and 20 years, is significant. And that relocating them out and taking them out and having no program to deal with the settlement who's left behind has a significant impact. And this is what happened in the settlement that I was researching. So when they relocated people out, there was a temporary collapse in the social system, and the ward councillor was able to deploy someone into position of executive settlement committee chairperson. And since then, they have been ruling the settlement using gangster-style tactics and siphoning the little money that does come into the settlement into their private bank accounts. Now, we've been very focused on trying to get everybody into a house, but we haven't stopped to look at what is happening in the wake of trying to achieve this goal. Now, the Cartesian worldview is heavily dominated by goal orientation, and it requires that the problem is linear and very neatly defined in order to achieve that goal. Now, when we start to look at social systems, they're generally highly complex and unpredictable, and therefore excluded out of the process. It is my view that we have been trying to use physical infrastructure to create the radical change that we so desire to see in our cities. But this is happening at the cost of the destabilization of larger social systems. And it is time that we move away from an ideal of eradication towards one of intervention, where we use an incremental whole systems approach to move people up towards a standard. I would like you to reflect back on your ideas at the beginning about what urban development is, and ask that each of you start to incrementally broaden your views about a far more interconnected and shared meaning of the city. Thank you.